Hey, it's Michael, your podcast coach. And in today's podcast episode, just released today, it's episode 85. It's titled Podcast versus YouTube. I answer a question about specifically my use of YouTube, but if you are a podcaster, if you're doing a podcast, if you're consistently releasing a podcast, should you use YouTube? And if you do use YouTube, how should you use it, or what are the best ways to use it? So in this episode, which I really encourage you to listen to, you can find episode 85 of Your Podcast Coach on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, really wherever you're listening to your favorite podcast. But in this particular episode, I talk about 3 different ways you can kind of think about YouTube from the perspective of being a podcast host. First and foremost, don't scoff at the idea. There are people, and it's kind of understandable, given my background in radio, their audio files are just like, oh my God, I'm only ever going to do a podcast because audio is the best medium and blah, 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 blah. And while there's some truths to the power of audio only medium, there are examples of where YouTube can just really benefit you. And what's so fascinating is I go through some of these in today's podcast episode. Please listen to it. But it wasn't until after it was published, one of my listeners, actually somebody who my coach, if you will, Kevin, said, interestingly enough, there are just some things that speak to visual better than audio. And it's so true, like just to simplify it. So at the beginning of today's episode, Jason, who is one of the premier glass blowers in the world, has a great podcast, Glass Blowers Companion Podcast. He's been on the podcast space for years. He does a lot of stuff with YouTube. He's a glass blower. It really benefits when he can show people physically what he's doing. Kevin is in home maintenance. He doesn't do a podcast, but he does a lot of stuff on YouTube because when you're dealing with like how to fix your home, it makes sense to show you what I'm trying to describe. Now, all that being said, YouTube and podcasts can go really, really well together. Audio podcasts have a tendency to be really powerful ways to tell a story, and you can craft stories in such a way where the intimacy of it really connects with a listener. And using YouTube as unique forms of content, or even if you want to publish a video of the episode that you're doing. And again, I get into that with today's podcast episode. There's a lot of things where YouTube and podcasts can go really well together. But sometimes the simplest answer is the best. If you're ever doing something, like say for instance, any of the videos where I showed you how to plug in a microphone or how to set up your home studio, if you're ever doing something with what you do as an entrepreneur, where it just would be better if I could show you, or you could show somebody, never underestimate the power of what YouTube can give to you. So I go really deep into this today with today's podcast episode, Podcast versus YouTube. It's episode 85 on whatever your favorite podcast app is. And by all means, please subscribe, click the button below so you'll get all these videos whenever I put them out, pretty much every week, if not a little bit more. And subscribe on your favorite podcast app to Your Podcast Coach. Thanks so much.